It sounds like my defence computer. It's one of those things with Kino. I don't use Kino very much. But I've been trying a couple of pieces. Oh, by the way, did you see my daughter's formal weeks?
I don't think so, although I've seen a number of them.
Oh, well, Terry wanted to thank you for the suggestion.
Oh, that's right.
Just what she wanted.
Yeah.
She kind of knows it. I mean,
How old is she? Good evening, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of our Lenten Spirituality series. So it is lovely to see you all again. Make sure you open the windows for the cross flow of air. It is a warm, sticky night, or maybe it's just me. But yes, thank you, it is a warm night. So we are progressing through to another expression of Christian spirituality, and I'm going to leave it for Cameron. He's got the uniform on, so he's clearly one of those holy people, and he'll tell you a bit about himself and what he's doing at the moment. But I don't know, we've known each other for some time, and Cameron's going to be sharing with us Celtic spirituality, which is a love of mine as well, and he's got excellent books there, which I think I'm just going to have to borrow the ones I don't have. And it's a whole... Are you pulling faces? No.
I'm shaking my head.
I could see Janet, she can give anything away. But of course, this is going to follow the format of our previous week. So Cameron will share, there'll be things on the PowerPoint. We are recording it so that I will share that with members of the congregation so you can pick up on things that you may have missed. And also there'll be an opportunity for questions or comments before we go into a time of reflection. So it's a lovely way to spend a Wednesday evening with all of you and looking at Celtic spirituality. So handing over to Cameron now, who will talk directly into this microphone, which is very important. And in fact, it might help to move it back a bit. We did that last week because it's one thing to do a reading or intercessions, but to be presenting, it gets a bit tricky. Hang on. Oh. So I'll let you play with that, but it's important to get right in.
Yeah, it's all right. It'll pick me up, I'm quite sure. Can everyone hear me? I don't think you'll have too much trouble with me talking into the microphone. My name's Cameron. I'm the rector of East Redland, so down in Cleveland, Redland Bay, Stradbroke Island, all of those sort of places. And some of those places out there lends itself to expressions of Celtic spirituality. I have known Nikki for a while. Nikki was the Archbishop's chaplain at my ordination to the diaconate. So do you remember that? There you go. I'll bet she doesn't really. So we're going to talk about Celtic spirituality, and the reason this has sort of come into my sphere of things over the last few years is that I started a Celtic service down in my last parish in Merriweather in Newcastle, specifically so it offered people space just to be in the presence of God, nothing else. There was no coffee and stuff afterwards. You came, you went as you wanted, and it was just a space to sit and reflect, and we were able to use various aspects of what was going on. Merriweather's a seaside suburb just like Cleveland, so we were able to incorporate aspects of the water. I decided to get clever one night and do the universe. And that's part of the Celtic thing. It's very earthy, very nature driven, and you'll see why as we go through this. So we do need to ask a couple of questions. I'm trying new technology here, so we'll just see how we go. That changed. So what we've got there is, what is Celtic Christianity? And these are just questions for you to ponder as we go along. What do you think of when you think of Celtic Christianity? Yeah. So you don't have to answer it, you can just ponder it. But also ponder how much influence Celtic spirituality has, or has had, and continues to have in the church at large. I've just noticed something in your church that is extremely Celtic. You may not have noticed it, but we'll come back to that at the end. No. You can wait till the end. That's like getting Christmas presents on Christmas Eve. It just won't do. So we'll talk about that, but think about think about Celtic imagery, the knotwork, all the Celtic crosses and all that sort of stuff, and have a think about what might be on your precinct that is a distinctly Celtic image. All right? So I don't want to... So the next slide is what I think of when I think of Celtic Christianity. So this is just me. It's only a 5 or 6 minute video. Don't panic. I hope the audio works when we play this. It should. It's running HDMI. But some of you may recognise the movie, some of you may not. But this is what I think of when I think of Celtic Christianity.
The 22nd day of September in the year 1400, by Shire reckoning. Bag End, Bagshot Row, Hobbiton, West Farthing. The Shire. Middle Earth. The third age of this world. There and back again. A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. Now, where to begin? Ah, yes. Concerning hobbits. Hobbits have been living and farming in the four farthings of the Shire for many hundreds of years, quite content to ignore and be ignored by the world of the big folk. Middle-earth being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, hobbits must seem of little importance, being neither renowned as great warriors nor counted among the very wise.
Frodo! Someone at the door.
In fact, it has been remarked by some that hobbits' only real passion is for food. A rather unfair observation, as we have also developed a keen interest in the brewing of ales and the smoking of pipeweed. But where our hearts truly lie is in peace and quiet and good tilled earth. For all hobbits share a love of things that grow. And yes, no doubt to others our ways seem quaint. But today of all days.
So the reason I think that that's what goes through my mind when I think of Celtic spirituality is because there's a real sense in that the hobbit holes are a part of, they don't cut the hills to build them, they build into them. So the natural landscape is a part of it. But that comment that where our true love is in the earth. And I think that that's a good representation of what Celtic something's beeping over here. It's all right, it's all right. That sense of the earthiness of Celtic spirituality, and that's reflected in its origins. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's what goes through my mind when I think of Celtic spirituality. So I'm just going to let this sort of do its thing. There are many kinds of Christianities around. So we've got Coptic Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Antioch Syrian, Roman Catholic, Protestant in various forms, Evangelical, Pentecostal, and Celtic. They're just a few things, but what it says is that each form of Christianity has emerged from its culture in some way. Just as Pentecostal Christianity has emerged out of the Azusa Street revival in the US, Celtic Christianity has evolved out of its history and its context. So it's important to keep that in mind. Even the Anglican Church has grown out of its history and context, which I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it's grown out of something. So Celtic Christianity is no different, and each emphasises different aspects of the gospel. So the Celtic Christianity is a merger of ancient Christian beliefs and ancient Celtic beliefs and practices. So where we would have things like the dove as an image of the Holy Spirit, the Celtic Church has the wild goose, because that's their frame of reference. Doves weren't something that they saw a lot of, but they saw plenty of wild geese. So, and there's different aspects of the goose that, for the Celts, spoke of the Spirit. So you can see how their context has informed that for them. So we do need to have a look at the bit of history, and I'm not going to go nuts on this because you could go absolutely crazy on the history. And you see these sort of things. That's part of the Celtic stuff in England. That's probably, I suspect that's the Vale of the White Horse in, I can't remember where, but that's what I suspect it is. Yeah, Wiltshire. So, I'll leave that there for the minute. We can say with some confidence that by approximately 1000 BC, the Celtic peoples, whatever they are, migrated from east of the Danube into Central and Western Europe. So from over this sort of area here. That migration saw settlements in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, France, Spain, northern Italy, and areas of ancient Turkey known as Galatia. Now that should sound familiar. And then throughout the British Isles. The settlements here saw the emergence of the cultural identity known as Latin, and that was the European Iron Age culture, which was born by the Celts or the Gauls, and we'll expand on that as we go through this. And it thrived, especially in artistic terms, until the Roman conquests of Europe and southern Britain, and in the case of Ireland, Scotland, beyond the period of Roman expansion. We do need to remember that northern Scotland and Ireland remained unaffected by Roman expansion. For whatever reason it was, the Romans just decided, no, we're not going there. I suspect that's why you've got Hadrian's Wall across Scotland. It's like, that's the line, no further. So these people are known to the Greeks as the Keltoi, from which the modern term Celts is derived, or Galatae, from the area of ancient Turkey known as Galatia, and that's where that name comes. So you're starting to see some familiar language here. The Romans called them Galli or Gauls, so mostly around, well, it's got Galli there, so France and those regions were known as Gauls, and both the Romans and the Greeks, really those terms just mean barbarians. And we know the Romans were at war with the Gauls for quite a while. There was also the Celtic migrations into Britain, and that took place in two major waves. The first wave came in the very early years of the Celtic expansion through Western Europe, and these people were identified by language as the Goidelic-speaking peoples, which gave rise to the closely related forms of Gaelic that are spoken in Ireland, the Isle of Man, in Scotland, etc. The people who came in second in a later migration were identified by a different language form, the Brythonic-speaking peoples, and their migration gave rise to the dominant forms of language spoken in southern Britain, in Wales, and later in Brittany. So that's a general picture. There were other waves of migration of the Celtics, but we won't go into that. But the conquest of Gaul in Europe and its subsequent absorption into the Roman Empire really brought an end to the existence of a clear, separate Celtic life and culture in Europe and in southern Britain. Wherever the Roman Church went, wherever the Roman Empire went, it just absorbed things. So a lot of the European Celtic culture was lost in that sense. It was absorbed into the Roman way of being, except for places like northern Scotland and Ireland, where they were allowed to sort of continue to develop independently. So the primary missionary movement across Britain came from those communities in Ireland and northern Scotland, and it became a hinge in history as much of Europe was evangelized. The Celts, through some of the readings, are recognised as the people who re-evangelised Europe after the Dark Ages. And they did it in particular ways. So you see lots of stories of the Celts doing that. You have Patrick to Ireland in 432, you've got Columba in 560, from Ireland to Iona, Aidan in 635 to Lindisfarne, Columbanus 591 to France, Italy, and it just goes on and on. So that sort of gives you a bit of a picture of the history of the Celts. As I said, we could go on for hours just about that, but I realise we've got limited time tonight. But generally speaking, the Celts, I'm trying to look at screens and not look at screens. The Celts loved, celebrated and venerated nature. And you can see elements in that in the reading in Paul's letter to the Galatians. You can see elements of this in it. They were a warrior people and could be violent. I know some Scottish people, they do get angry. They're a passionate people who loved celebrations and natural pursuits. And there were multiple influences in Britain, some of which might have been Druidic as well as. So that gives you a bit of a picture of their context. So we need to look at some early perspectives in Celtic Christianity, and this goes back into the I'd say the mid-6th century AD. And we need to look at a couple of people here. We need to look at Pelagius, who was a Celtic theologian, and we need to compare Pelagius to the work of Augustine of Hippo, because we know that Augustine of Hippo is the one that really won the day, but we'll see, and that just seems to be the way it is. But it's interesting to compare the pair. So let's look at Pelagius and the roots of Celtic spirituality. Pelagius's work, and I say up front, Pelagius was excommunicated as a heretic. So we need to get that out there. But when you hear this, you probably, why? So we'll just keep that in mind, that he was excommunicated as a heretic. But a lot of his work is rooted in Genesis 1 and 2. So that is the creation narratives, but that God's creation was a good creation. And as we can see, just how much the Celtic tradition is rooted in the creation and the incarnation, just by its artwork, by the way it does its liturgy and all that sort of stuff. There was an emphasis for Pelagius on both scripture and creation. What he means by that is that we can see and experience the presence of God in both. We experience God in scripture, but we also experience God in the created world. So there's an emphasis for Pelagius on God's goodness and on our goodness from being created in God's image. So I've just got that up there. Yes, good. Pelagius believed, and this is what theologians will call a panentheistic way of being, and that's just that a belief that the divine pervades and interpenetrates all parts of the universe. So Pelagius is certainly down that end of the spectrum. But within that, he believed that within the created order, we have the capacity to glimpse what he called divine shafts of light that penetrate the thin veil dividing heaven and earth, which I think is a beautiful way of viewing things. He also believed this to be most true in the essential goodness of humanity, and maintained that the image of God can be seen in every human being, and in particular it can be seen in every newborn child. And that, although sometimes obscured by sin, the essential image of God exists in the heart of every person. Pelagius believed that looking into the face of a newborn was to look into an image of God. That's in stark contrast to Augustine, and was ultimately part of the argument for him being excommunicated as a heretic. Isn't that extraordinary? And in the light of that point, he does recognise sin's ability to obscure our goodness, but not to obliterate our goodness. God's image persists within our hearts and minds and deep within us. So the Celtic tradition holds a special place also for the Apostle John. Why, we might ask? Well, the Gospel of John paints a vivid picture of the Last Supper as a place of great intimacy. Around the table, John is portrayed as the one who is leaning on the heart of Jesus. The image speaks deeply of the spiritual tradition represented by the Celts. It's passionate, it's intimate, it values friendship. So John's Gospel comes to us as a work of intellectual insight and intimate passion. So this unusual combination suggests something of the contribution to Celtic mission. Now, it has to be said that the notion of a special place for the Apostle John was a concept that strongly emerged during the Synod of Whitby in 664. And what it signifies is the perception of John reclining on the Lord and listening to the heartbeat of God. So there's a book over there called Listening to the Heartbeat of God. That's not necessarily Pelagian in that sense, or a beginning point in the emergence of the Celtic Church, but it does suggest that there's an ancient stream of contemplative spirituality that stretches back. Well, there's an ancient stream of contemplative spirituality within the Celtic Church that stretches back to John and possibly into the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So let's have a look at our friend Augustine, because the Church throughout the last 2,000 years has been enormously influenced by the work of Augustine. Augustine's work is rooted in Genesis 3, which is the story of the fall. The emphasis for Augustine is Scripture only as the mediator of the engagement with God. The emphasis on humanity's fall and being born in sin. So he sees sin as corrupting human life and leading us into depravity that has corrupted the world. Therefore, all humanity is sinful. Augustine believed that every child is born sinful, that through conception and birth we lack the image of God until it's restored through baptism. Conception also involves humanity in the sinfulness of nature. So Augustine had a real problem with sex. And that's just not that he had a problem with the idea of it, he actually had a real problem with it. He was known as a womanizer, which is ironic. I mean, so it's probably, this spirituality is probably more to do with his own issues. It emphasizes that goodness can only be restored through Christ as mediated through the church and through the sacraments. So this form of spirituality also accentuated a division between the church, which was seen as holy and on the one hand, and the life of the world, which was perceived as godless on the other. So that might be a notion that sort of underpins dualism. So what we have here is, in the Celtic tradition, is a spirituality characterized by a listening within all things for the life of God. It's a very creation and incarnation form of spirituality. It's very earthy, and if we can put it like that. But what does it look like? And I mean, ask yourself the question, which version of Christianity would you prefer? Would you prefer the Pelagian view or the Augustinian view? I know which sounds more pleasant. I'm not denying either as a valid expression of anything, but imagine imagine sort of that idea of everyone who walks into our church is characterized by the intrinsic goodness of creation, that in that person, no matter who they are, is an image of God. It's a much more Jesus-oriented way of looking at things. So, we need to have a look at some aspects of Celtic community. That should say Christianity, but anyway. The first thing is monasticism. This was really important in the Celtic Church. So, in the Celtic Christian worldview, church was monastic. Now, I know we all have a picture of what monastic might mean, and it's usually about monasteries with big walls and people who stay inside. But that's not how the Celts saw it. So when we talk about the Celtic Church, it's synonymous with the monastery. Not that people lived in monasteries necessarily, but it was about people living in community with a central emphasis on practice. That is, it was to live which is relational and personal within community. So it's that come and see of John 1:43. It's seeking to be at home with Jesus. It was asking the questions, who is it that you seek? And how shall we live? That's why soul friends were encouraged within the Celtic tradition. Has anyone ever read the book Anam Cara? I haven't got it there with me, but there was a book written by John O'Donoghue called Anam Cara, which is soul friend. And he writes, in the Celtic tradition there is a beautiful understanding of love and friendship. One of the fascinating ideas here is the idea of soul love. The old Gaelic term for this is Anam Cara. Anam is the Gaelic word for soul and Cara is the word for friend. So Anam Cara in the Celtic world was the soul friend. In the early Celtic church, a person who acted as a teacher, a companion, or a spiritual guide was called an Anam Cara. Anam Cara was originally someone to whom you confessed, revealing the hidden intimacies of your life. With the Anam Cara, you could share your innermost self, your mind and your heart. This friendship was an act of recognition and belonging. When you had an Anam Cara, your friendship cut across all convention. You were joined in an ancient and eternal way with the friend of your soul. So the Celtic understanding did not set limitations of space and time on the soul. There is no cage for the soul. The soul is a divine light that flows into you and into your other, which is a beautiful way of looking at things. So Ray Simpson, who's very much connected with the Lindisfarne community, says the value of community is immeasurable, yet as the experience of community vanishes, and we all know that feeling of community vanishing, the longing for it increases. It is possible for a comfortable, wealthy society to revolve. Is it possible for a comfortable, wealthy society to revolve around God? Is it possible to create models of an alternative society? And I think the monastery in the Celtic understanding was that alternative model. It was a school where the seeking of God, that one thing necessary was the foundation of life. Teaching what we live by, living what we teach. This is why, as community, many of the new Celtic style communities talk about a new monasticism. Things like the Iona community, the Lindisfarne community, the Northumbria community, and there's another one in southern England. It'll come to me later on. That's why they're sort of going down this path, this idea of new monasticism, because they believe that God has called people together as a contemporary expression of the desert, of the monastic tradition, which draws from and is inspired by Celtic heritage. And Ray Simpson actually says, true monasticism becomes a separation from everything that divides people. So it's not just about separating people from people, it's separating everything that divides people. And they status, manipulation, possessive relationships, or the use of material things. So he says it's possible to be married or to be part of a local church community and to live as a monk. One contemporary definition of a monk is one who separates from everybody in order to be united to everyone. So the Athona community was the other one I was thinking about in southern England. The next one is sacramental. They're a very sacramental people. Now, we have an idea in our head of what sacramental means. But for the Celts, this was the celebration of ordinariness and an earthed and grounded humanity. They believed that nothing was secular because everything was sacred. Everything was shot through with God, so everything was sacred. Nothing for the Celtic church was outside God's love and grace. David Adams said that the vision of the Celts was sacramental rather than mystical. They saw God in and through things rather than in direct visions. The Celt says we must take time to learn and play. What we hear, see, smell, taste, and touch all speaks of God. So when we look at it like that, it is an incarnational understanding of things. It's embodied. I mean, just the fact that we hear, smell, see, taste, touch, that's an embodied understanding of what they're experiencing and how they see the world and God. So it was a picture of what you might call holy worldliness, where an integrated life of body and soul, work and worship, wonder and ordinariness, prayer and life were the normal way of functioning. It's a world that sees everything containing God's sacramental purpose, and it encourages a reverence for God's creation and a respect and care for the world. Esther de Waal says that the Celtic approach to God opens up a world in which nothing is too common to be exalted, and nothing is too exalted that it cannot be made common. They believe that the presence of God infuses daily life and thus transforms daily life, so that at any moment, any object, any job of work can become a place of encounter with God. Everything that we do, everything that we live can be a place of encounter with God. So when we look at this in terms of Columba, St. Columba, the monastery in Iona, exemplified a rhythm of work and worship. And it said that the days were filled with prayer, study, and manual labour. In dairy and granary or in the fields, each worshipping God in his appointed task, and made his toil a sacramental thing. The secret of the early Celts lay in this, that they linked sacrament with service, altar with hearth, and worship with work. So prayer then becomes an inner disposition that presents in every activity of life. It becomes a love that always tends towards its beloved, even when it must attend to something else. So it's that emphasis that the world is shot through with God's sacramental purposes. The next thing is contemplation and mission. And mission in this sense is about being sent or obedience to the task. It's about connecting with people. It's about connecting with community on the road, building relationships, exploring spirituality, living in the story and living out the story. And one of the things the Celts used to do was to go off in twos, and they'd go into communities, they'd learn the language, they'd learn the culture, and they would then evangelise within their understanding of that language and culture. Rather than doing what the early Roman Church did, was when they came in, you will do it this way. This is how you will do stuff, this is how you will act. The Celts did it very differently. And that this is exemplified by the ebb and the flow of tides on a holy island. Or for the community, it's engaging in mission out of a context of being in the monastery. So that sense of the deep spirituality of prayer and engagement with God in that sort of sends people out of the monasteries, but they need to come back in to recharge. So there's this constant interconnection between mission and spirituality. And as I said, that's exemplified by the ebb and flow of tides on Holy Island at Lindisfarne. It's significant that Aidan, coming from Iona, chose Lindisfarne as his mission centre because it's closed off from the mainland for half of the day. Aidan chose Lindisfarne because it reminded him of Iona, but also because it reminded him of the need for the cell and for the coracle, which was their little boats. Being and doing, monastery fueling mission, seeking God in the heart in order to better serve God in the world. You often see in this that the Celts just up and get in a boat. They've got no plans to go anywhere. They go where the tides take them or where the winds take them. And there's an old story. 3 Irishmen came to King Alfred in a boat without any oars from Ireland, whence they had stolen away because they wished to go on a pilgrimage for the love of God they cared not where. They don't care where they end up. They just trust that God's got them going somewhere. So the tides might take them anywhere. So, this is this thing. It's born out of this idea of we just want to share our love of God with the community around us, but it's built out of this deep monastic prayer. So the next part of this is about, and I'm just trying to skip through this because I'm keeping an eye on my watch, hospitality and generosity. welcoming God into their hearts each day, but also welcoming others, because that person could be Christ. That's actually a very Benedictine thing as well. As if you go to a Benedictine monastery, as I do every year, they're always excited to see you. And it doesn't matter who you are. They'll thank God you're here, because they could be welcoming Jesus in amongst their midst. So when Cuthbert went into his inner farn solitude, he built a guest room for God. So it's being aware of the teaching of Matthew 25, in as much as you did to the least of these, you did it to me, and also that Hebrews 13 thing of you might be entertaining angels unaware. Hospitality is seen in the care of the poor, and we see that with Aidan, who was given many gifts by King Oswald, but he in turn then shared those gifts with ordinary people, including a horse that he gave away and lots of silver plate that he had melted down, broken up and distributed to the people. Aidan stopped and spoke to whoever he met, both rich and poor. If they were heathen, he invited them to embrace the mystery of faith and be baptized. If they were already believers, he strengthened their faith. So no one was off limits to the Celts. And we see that, particularly in Aidan, it's a ministry symbolised by an outstretched hand. He liked to walk among the peoples, and to the unbelievers he brought the hope of belief. To the newly converted, he taught the value of prayer and scripture. He encouraged them in generosity and acts of mercy. He demonstrated that in his own life, always aware of and quick to respond to the needs of the poor. And he even worked to buy people out of slavery. And St. Cuthbert said, "Live in mutual harmony with all other servants of Christ. Do not despise those faithful who come to you seeking hospitality. Receive them, put them up, and set them on their way with kindness, treating them as one of yourselves. Do not ever think yourselves better than the rest of your companions who share the same faith and follow the monastic life." But I do like what St. Ita says. 3 things that please God most are true faith in God with a pure heart, a simple life with a grateful spirit, and generosity inspired by charity. 3 things that most displease God are a mouth that hates people, a heart harbouring resentments, and confidence in wealth. I mean, these are people who were generous and welcoming. And don't get me wrong, they could be hard too, but at the core of this is generosity and welcoming. They were very Trinitarian. I'm not going to go nuts on this. We're familiar with the Trinity. But we see this, Patrick's breastplate hymn is born out of this. I bind unto myself this day the strong name of the Trinity. So they were very Trinitarian-oriented people. But as I said, we've got a reasonable idea of that, I think. So they had a love of learning. There's a deep love of the scriptures as God's I like this. The scriptures are God's memory book of relationships and encounter. I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it. St. Aidan said, "It seems to me, brother, that you have been unduly severe with your ignorant hearers. You should have followed the guidance of the apostle and offered them at first the milk of simpler teaching, until gradually, growing strong on the food of God's word, they could take a fuller statement of the faith and carry out God's more exalted commands." So it's again that generosity, recognising where people are in their journeys, not making it too overcomplicated when it doesn't need to be. And I think there is quite a strong overlap between this and Benedictine spirituality with the 3 Benedictine vows of stability, obedience, and daily conversion of life, particularly with the obedience part of it. Obedience, we get in our mind, is just doing what we're told, but for the Benedictines, it comes from a word that means to listen. And the first couple of lines of the Rule of St. Benedict are, "Listen with the ear of your heart." And that sort of fits that idea of the Celtic thing, listening for the heartbeat of God. Listening in these things is very important. So whether the Celts influenced Benedict or whether Benedict influenced the Celts, who knows, but there is some sort of connection there. The other thing is their understanding of time. In our Western culture, we tend to have a very linear view of time, but the Celts saw things differently. And it's often reflected in their artwork and their knotwork. We notice when we look at their knotwork and their artwork, There's no end and no beginning. We all know what Celtic crosses look like. They've got the circle. There's no end and no beginning. And we see that in the Trinity, we see that in the Tree of Life motif, and we see that, as I said, in Celtic crosses. And clearly the Celts have had a massive influence on modern Christian imagery. I did have a look before. The red brick doesn't have it on there, but my red brick has a Celtic cross on it. So Celtic imagery has been very influencing in, so this isn't the Western mentality of every second counts and we have to live at 100 miles an hour. Time was a sacred dimension and they used it wisely and well, which is why you see this great respect for the seasons of the year. Not just the calendar seasons like summer, winter, but the liturgical seasons as well. And it's about, for the Celts, it was about God's time. That's about the kairos, not the chronos. The Celts simply didn't see time as chronological, that is, one historical event following another, rather that God was and is to come the eternal God. Just as Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So with that in mind, the past, present, and the future are all linked into God's now. So the lives of Columba, Bridget, Hilda, Aidan, Patrick, and whoever else you want to name are our spiritual contemporaries as well in the Celtic view. So read Hebrews 12 with that in mind. See the relay race, the passing of the baton as the ongoingness of the communion of saints and the continuity of the church throughout time and space. So in the knowledge of all that, have a think, as I said before, have a think about the influence of Celtic spirituality in the church's life. As I said before, as I was walking back over before, is that a bell tower at the front? There's a cross on top? It's a Celtic cross on top. I mean, the influence goes everywhere, and you'll see it in all sorts of places. I haven't seen it. I haven't got my glasses on, so it's not helping me. But if you look around, you'll see these influences. So to come to some sort of conclusion here, what I want to encourage you to do in a very Celtic way, I want to encourage you in a very Celtic way with the words of St Hilda of Whitby. And why am I going to use that? Well, because Sister Hilda, who's now Mother Hilda at Jamberoo Abbey, has encouraged and journeyed with me as my sister mentor for 11 years while I've been an oblate of Jamberoo. And when I read this, I just thought, this is so Mother Hilda. So St Hilda says, trade with the gifts God has given you, bend your minds to holy learning, you may escape the fretting moth of littleness of mind that would wear out your souls. Brace your wills to action, that they may not be the spoils of weak desires. Train your hearts and lips to song. Train your hearts and lips to song gives courage to the soul. Being buffeted by trials, learn to laugh. Being reproved, give thanks. Having failed, determined to succeed. And that brings us to the end. I fear questions may be coming.
Well, we have a microphone. Oh, it does work. Well, we have a microphone to give you the opportunity to ask Cameron for extra clarification, any other
I don't guarantee I have any.
Stories, any comments at all. For me, you mentioned Hilda, so I didn't even know such a thing as the Celtic branch of Christianity even existed until I happened to get a job teaching at St Hilda's at Southport. I didn't even know there was a saint called Hilda, and so I rapidly learnt something about not only Hilda but the Celtic Church, and so hence began my interest in that journey as well. So for me, it has been quite a part of my spiritual development.
Just adding to that, particularly since it was International Women's Day, St Hilda was a formidable woman. In 664, she was a formidable woman. I wouldn't have liked to go on up against her. I mean, I think she would have run rings around her male counterparts. I really do. Absolutely formidable.
And I think she was in charge of the monastery in Whitby for men and women, which in its day was made possible because it was part of the Celtic Church, not the Roman Church. No. So as a result, here was this woman, so the Synod of Whitby, and they were arguing 3 things from memory.
Ridiculous.
The date of Easter, how the monks should shave their head.
The monks' tonsure.
The tonsure. What was the third thing they were arguing?
I don't remember, but that was silly enough for me.
And so they were some of the key things that were being argued in 660 whatever.
664, yeah.
664, and Hilda was a formidable woman by all accounts. Yeah. So, yes, an excellent saint to have for an all-girls school. Yep. But any comments or questions from anyone here tonight? Yeah, talk.
Thanks, Cameron. What you've highlighted is something which is interesting. You show the Celtic community and all the Roman Christianity and all the others. There must have been a lot of divisions when you had St. Pelagius and Augustus and all setting up their own little groups. Were there excommunication, you indicated? Do we know whether there were a lot of groups in Ireland and in England which were anti the others alongside?
Were anti?
Well, anti because we have Protestants, Catholics, Evangelical you alluded to.
Yep.
Did that exist as your...
I don't know that it would have existed in that sort of concrete a form. I think I think the reality of any spirituality that you sort of start to look at it is it's always going to be influenced by its context. It's just like I was talking about this the other day. I mean, the church in England prior to its secession from the Roman Catholic Church, Henry VIII has done the succession there, and they've acceded from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. But for the average person day to day, worship would have still been Catholic. So I think the contexts really drive all of that sort of stuff. For the political machinations of it are probably more what's reported, but for the average person, it's probably just the same. There wouldn't have been those major divisions, I don't think. I just think within whatever the society is.
As a midwife, can I make an observation? If you've ever looked into the eyes of a newborn baby, I don't know how anybody believed that they were born in sin.
No, I don't know either. I've always found
so
that...
I'd suggest he didn't look into the eyes of newborn babies very often.
No, well, he was too busy struggling with his issues around sex, I think, but...
Augustine has much to answer for, really. Any other thoughts or comments? Joy.
Oh. Pelagius only had a 5-year rule. Was there any particular reason why it was so short-lived?
Pelagius and his 5-year rule. Pelagius' 5-year rule.
I don't know about Pelagius and a 5-year rule. The date's up there. I suspect that's just when he was sort of active in those debates.
Just when he was doing his talking, when he was active and out there.
Because he was excommunicated, so he wouldn't have had much more to do with the major debates. So.
Once...
The Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, because the thing is that the Roman Church came into England, they spread out, they're going, we're going to tell everyone about Jesus. And they met these pagan Celts who lived quite a spiritual life, very earthy, very in touch with one another, with community, with nature. And so it actually was one of the most smooth transitions for many of them when they found out, oh, Christianity does that. Well, we kind of have this symbolism. That makes sense. And one of the most interesting things I was told many years ago is the idea of a church building made sense to the Celts because they loved their trees and the forest. So if you can visualise two tree trunks and the branches coming together is just like the classic frame of a cathedral door. And they went, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And if you look at, and actually, if you look in St John's Cathedral, the inside, the vaulting actually looks like great big trees.
Yeah, yeah.
Not that the Celts influenced that, but I mean, it's just...
Yeah, so again, back to the Synod of Whitby, it really was when the Roman Church won out. They were more powerful. They were probably, I don't know, I'd say buffier, but they just railroaded a few. So the Celtic spirituality that we can look at now probably pulled back a little bit. Hence Ireland, hence Northern England, Scotland.
The other reality of all of this is that what we see in modern Celtic spirituality, like what's represented up here, is probably not consistent with how the Celts would have worshipped back in the day. If you have a look at something like the Stowe Missal, it looks quite familiar to, the sort of worship services we would be familiar with. But I think what these communities are doing are hearkening back into something that is looking at those principles of monastic existence, of Trinitarian, and putting stuff. I mean, it's very creative liturgy, but I suspect it's not a reflection of ancient Celtic worship. And there is some debate around that as well as to whether or not the picture we've painted of the Celts is accurate or not, but I haven't delved into that one as much.
Because obviously it can be quite romanticised. I mean, many years ago you couldn't buy all these books.
No, you couldn't.
They weren't created, but there was some stuff out there that was much more pagan in nature, so people just got very, very nervous about it. Whereas it's important to recognise that which is the Christian tradition behind it. There's something I was going to say. And you?
I've been very inspired by John O'Donoghue's writing in the last 6 months when I've come to know more. He's got a beautiful use of language.
He does.
Has he had much of an influence in present-day thoughts on a world base?
I think he was fairly heavily involved in a lot of discussion when he was alive. Look, I suspect that John O'Donoghue's had a big impact on modern Celtic spirituality.
Yes, I would think he probably has, actually.
I would find it hard to believe that. I mean, he's written quite a few books, and some of his poetry is lovely.
Oh, it's absolutely.
But I can't imagine. I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but I cannot imagine that he hasn't had an impact on modern sort of Celtic spirituality. But just as much as the Iona community have. These communities are prolific in what they put out. So
it seems to be spreading more globally, though, this way of thinking. Is it?
I think it's because, I've been reflecting on things like this for a while. I think part of it is because it's delving back into some ideas that I think we feel we've lost, particularly those ideas of community, of groundedness, recognising this way, but it's not so doctrinally motivated. If you have a look at what's going on just in the church in general, and I'll be careful because I know Nikki's taping this, much of the issues in the church now are doctrinally driven as opposed to spiritually driven. And what I think it's doing is just driving wedges between people, and that to me doesn't seem to be consistent with what the Celts would have been looking at. Is that fair? I notice Nikki's being very quiet.
Because it's being taped.
Yes, it's because all the churches are bugged.
Yeah. I think that's one of the daily sense of that which is sacred is what really struck me when I was in my early 20s. I'd been a Christian my whole life, but when I learnt a bit about Celtic spirituality and the embrace of the everyday, and you'll hear it in my sermons, you'll be going, yeah, you've said that before, but it's an everyday love, an everyday sense of who we are in this place. And so we believe that early Celts from their pagan days would have, I often used to talk to students about, well, until someone is, has the idea of the God that we believe we know, and Jesus and the Spirit, that what have they got? They've got the world, they've got the sun that rises and it gives them warmth and it helps things to grow. So the Celts, we believe, had a great sense of thankfulness for the rising of the sun. Mm-hmm. I rise today and I stoke my fire and I am thankful.
Yep.
I arise today and I boil the water. I am thankful. And when Christianity was introduced to the pagan Celts, it became, well, we'll just continue that. I arise today and I thank God for the warmth of the sun, for the ability to cook my brekkie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, just as a sort of to emphasise what Nikki's saying, in a strange way, and I noticed this the other day because I go out to Stradbroke Island as part of our normal sort of worship stuff, but you know, you get on the boat, you go across to Straddy, someone might pick you up or you might catch the bus, but you all of a sudden notice a slower pace. You've got 20 minutes from Cleveland to Stradbroke Island. So you've got time to read. You suddenly find you're assimilating what you're reading. You're starting to think. But I don't know if you've noticed it on Straddy. This Celtic stuff on Straddy it's alive. You can actually sense this stuff out there. I don't know why. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but I found myself the other day understanding this Celtic spirituality stuff better while I was on Stradbroke Island than I would naturally do when I'm back in Cleveland. It's really, really weird. But you go over, there's a sense of the creation. There's a sense of Straddy's a very different place to go. There's a different sense of time on Stradbroke Island. So there is something to this. And that's not delving into anything sort of just within the Indigenous side of things on Stradbroke Island, because it's a very large part of Stradbroke Island. But you can sense this stuff. It's extraordinary. I was up at Point Lookout on Sunday, and it was just wonderful celebrating a Eucharist at Point Lookout. And you know that the beach is down there. You can hear the waves. You can hear all this stuff, and you suddenly get a bigger sense of God's involvement. So it's a strange thing, but just from my experience of going, I don't feel that on Macleay Island and Russell Island for some reason. But Straddy is a different kettle of fish. So yeah, there you go. It was just, but I just a couple of things, just a couple of stories jumped into my head just about this idea of, and you can all tell me to stop, because I'll just keep going. When I was in Merriweather, there was a morning at our 7:30 service. And this man came into the church, and he was very disabled. He was on a walker. He was very physically disabled, emotionally disabled. Or he was in a world of hurt. And he was sitting in the back of the church, and he was making all sorts of noise, lots of crying, all that sort of stuff. And someone came up to me, one of the parishioners, "Oh, do you want me to get him? You want me to kick him out?" I said, "No, just leave him. He'll come in, he'll do his thing, he'll go. Just let him do his thing." Anyway, we're just doing the service, and there was lots of stuff, lots of noise coming from him, but we just let... Anyway, when I came to preach, because the pulpit was sort of up higher, but he came down the aisle and he sat on his walker right in front of the pulpit, right underneath me. And he was crying, and I came down after my sermon and he said, "Would you please bless me?" So I prayed with him, I blessed him, and off he went. At the end of the service, I said to everybody, because I felt this right through the service, and this is going into the hospitality and generosity and sacramentality and all that sort of stuff. I said, is it just me, did anyone else feel like Jesus was here today? It was extraordinary. And everyone said, yeah, we all felt it. Here's someone that someone wanted to kick out for being different and for being noisy, and it was that Hebrews thing. We felt like we'd entertained angels without knowing it. It was extraordinary. So it just shows the importance of seeing the inherent goodness of people. You know, not, you know, you don't fit in here on your bike, Squire. You know, just the goodness of people, no matter how different they are. So, anyway, I've probably rambled on now.
That's all right. Are there any more final comments or questions? Cameron, do you have another prayer reflection to just tie all the night
I have another
together?
video, but it's going to go for 15 minutes. You may want to go home.
I don't think 15 minutes is quite where most of us are at on a Wednesday, but we can put it on later if anyone wants it. But
It's on
we
that
might,
video.
yeah. Sorry.
It's on that PowerPoint, so if you want to use it.
Okay.
It's just something I've put together with some audio.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, we might incorporate that at a later time.
Yep. I'll show you after.
Excellent.
Yep.
Do you have a prayer just to send us on our way? Otherwise, I just found one here.
Plenty of prayers over here.
Oh, look at this.
Vicky's found one.
I just went to one that I prepared earlier. Okay. I love this book here. Here's one we prepared earlier. When I do not know what to pray. There are so many different examples, but I invite you to join me in silence and in recognition of the sacred space that we hold with one another and with our God. Circle all of us here, loving God. Keep comfort near and discouragement afar. Keep peace within and turmoil out. Circle each one of us here, loving God. Keep hope within, despair without. Keep light near and darkness afar. Circle this parish of St. Mark's, loving God. Keep peace within and anxiety without. The compassing of the sacred three be upon us all. The compassing of the sacred three protect us all. The compassing of the sacred three preserve us all. Amen.
Amen. Feel free to come and have a look at any of that.
Beautiful books up here to have a bit of a look, and if any of you find something you'd like to order online, you don't know how to do that, I can help you do that. And apparently we can't pocket them and take them with us this evening. But thank you, Cameron, very much for joining us and for taking time out of your Lenten time. And I notice you weren't on the Zoom at 5 o'clock, as I was not this afternoon either, because I wasn't. And you were here when it was finishing?
Yeah, I wasn't there either. I decided I was going to
This is I mentioned in the sermon the other day, I was participating in Hard Edge conversations coming out of London, St Martin in the Fields. We pop in and out of these things. Friends, thank you for joining us again this evening. If you would like to know more, there is plenty more. As always, we scratch the surface, but this is the excitement of looking at so many different kinds of spiritualities that we can just find something that tickles our souls and might just set us off on a new set of reading or learning for the year ahead. You might be tickled by all of them. Next week, from memory, might be the eco-spirituality with Reverend Suzanne. I think that's next week, so I look forward to that one as well. But please come and have a look, chat to Cameron, and have a play with some of these things. So thank you once again. Thank you. Chapel clap.